Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Hamid. In today's program, we are going to take up for discussion the important developments happening on the economic front as far as the Pakistani authorities, their efforts in stabilizing the country's economy is concerned, that very trajectory of reforms that have been introduced, those difficult decisions which have been brought in order to stabilize the country's economy. Also, for a fact, we know that Pakistan's delegation, which has been led by Secretary Finance and the Governor of the State Bank of Pakistan, met with the Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Kenji Okamura, in Washington, and the meeting basically focused on discussing the Pakistan's ongoing reforms aimed at improving the country's economic position. During this particular high-level meeting, Pakistan's side outlined the key measures which the authorities in the recent past have taken, which include expanding the fiscal space by broadening the tax base, aligning the provincial agriculture income tax, federal income tax regime, rationalizing subsidies, reducing energy sector costs, right-sizing the government. Also, there were discussions regarding the initiatives to stimulate private sector growth, also build climate resilience through resilience and sustainability financing, and also maintaining prudent monetary and external sector policies. We also know that Finance Minister Mohammad Aurangzeb has also departed for the US, and he is going to engage in high-level interactions as far as the meetings, the annual meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are also concerned. Also, there has been a development as to the bullish trend at the Pakistan stock exchanges. All these matters are for discussion in today's show. For that, we are honored to be joined in the studio by Mr. Sultan Ali Haider, expert political economy. Mr. Haider, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on the show tonight. We really appreciate that. Also in the studio, we are honored to have been joined by Mr. TalhaTufail Bhatti. He is heading Strengthening Regional Climate Resilience Program at Institute of Regional Studies in Islamabad. Talha, thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on the show tonight. Really appreciate that. On Skype at the same time, we are honored to have been joined by Dr. KhaqanNajeeb, former advisor, Ministry of Finance. Dr. Najeeb, thank you very much once again for taking time out for Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. Both of you gentlemen, if you allow me, let me begin the discussion with Dr. KhaqanNajeeb. Dr. Najeeb, for the general understanding of the masses, I just want you to shed a bit of light regarding the significance of these annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. What are the major things which are discussed, especially in the context of Pakistan recently being approved of that $7 billion extended fund facility program?
So, Jawad, whenever we've spoken, I've always said that Pakistan's economic stability, Pakistan's macro stability, Pakistan's funding needs all require Pakistan's engagement with the IMF. So we have been able to cement a $7 billion program with the IMF. That is important. It has given you macro stability, which means clearly the following. Inflation is trending down. Pakistan's external current account deficit has stabilized. Pakistan reserves are nearly more than 2 months of import cover. Remember that they were less than a month's cover, go back about 12, 14 months. And with all that, what you're seeing is that investor confidence, at least in the short term, stock exchange has boomed, and you can see that the exchange has performed well. At the back of all this, Pakistan has given a tough budget, tougher than it would have been if we were not engaged with the fund. Pakistan has reviewed its energy prices. Pakistan has done reforms on the SOEs. We've met all the prior conditions and are now trying to meet the performance criteria, the QPCs, the quantitative performance criteria, the indicative targets, and whatever has been agreed with the fund till March, so that when the review happens in March of the December targets, we are well within the framework that has been agreed. My second contention to you would be that this is not going to be easy by any stretch of imagination. As far as the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank Group are concerned, they're significant global event where the leaderships of the economies from all over the world get a platform to show, whether it's in the plenary session where all the members discuss broad topics relevant to the global economy. So every contingent gets a sense of how the global economy is going to behave, how the rate cuts are being talked about, how the fiscal stimuli are being talked about. For example, the two economies which make the world work, the US is being upgraded. I was just reading, half an hour ago, they have upgraded the US estimates for growth next year, the IMF outlook, which has just come out. The US interest rates or the policy rates are trending down. They cut 0.5% last time. They are likely to cut another 0.25 in the subsequent meetings. China has just given a very big fiscal and monetary stimuli to get their economies moving. So, in the plenary sessions, all leaderships get a sense of how the world and the global economy is behaving, so that when you structure your own economy in the coming 1 to 2 years, you have a global picture. Then, there is the development committee meetings. They are focused on issues which are related to international development and poverty reduction. And here, countries like Pakistan, have a say and have a thing. Then broadly, the monetary and the financial issues affecting the global economy are discussed. And Pakistan, of course, being in a fund program, gets to showcase to the IMF folks, to the World Bank folks, what we are doing within the framework of the IMF. We've passed 1 quarter, so the September 30th results are in. We know our fiscal side, we know our monetary side, we know how the external is behaving. And these things then, now in Pakistan's case, I think another area that is likely to come under discussion is the RSF. The RSF is a resilience facility that a member country can get if they are in an 18-month program, and Pakistan is, if they are in the middle income status, Pakistan is, if they have a set of reforms that they can put in terms of climate resilience that Pakistan can give. I can also tell you that we have recently written a report in this regard. I've not had a chance to read that report, but the fund had us engage in that report, and Pakistan also probably wanted to, as we were already thinking that we would be, moving here. And more so, I think, then there are obviously a chance to meet the bilateral partners, the important one being China, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and the African country you want to do trade there. So this is largely the significance. But what I'm hoping is that Pakistan can also showcase, beyond these debt instruments, the non-debt creating instruments. And you mentioned earlier that Pakistan now is in real need of investment capital. Our investment to GDP has come down to nearly 13% of GDP. All countries, and here I use the word all and I use it very carefully, very clearly, who have progressed over the last 4 5 decades: China, Vietnam, East Asia, India. One thing that stands common is that they have held their investment to GDP around 30% on the average. China has gone much beyond, because that is what creates economic growth, because investment is the only way. And there are three kinds of investment: the public sector investment, which comes from provincial and federal authorities; the private sector domestic investment, which comes from the private sector getting excited to invest; and the third is the FDI, which comes from the foreign direct investment. So I'm really hoping that we can
So
showcase that
which
the
one is
reforms are
required
in
the
place.
most here, keeping Pakistan's scenario in front? Which one of these three that you have mentioned is of utmost significance?
So if I was to rate in order of precedence, I would say that private sector Pakistan investors have to be engaged the most. And the reason I say that is that if you see the kind of capital that we are told Pakistanis have invested in Dubai, a figure of $11 billion, and the capital that is in dead investment in Pakistan, in the real estate of Pakistan, um, this has to be channeled into more productive areas, be it service sector, be it manufacturing, or be it agriculture. But at the same time, you also need to get FDI coming, because you're trying to sell assets to the world, and these are assets in the form of energy sector, aviation, some banks. So you probably need FDI. But here's the trick. I think what Pakistan has kind of not made a framework for is that you need managerial investment from abroad also. You need technological investment from abroad also. So a lot must depend on how we are able to forge partnerships where Pakistan's firms engage with firms abroad to bring in not only money, which is important, but more so the technological and the managerial transfer to make us more productive, to make us more efficient, and to improve our quality. Have one car that we can sell to the world. We've been making cars for the last 40 years, or at least assembling. I mean, Fortuner, when it was made in Thailand, it was sold all over the world. That's one of the Toyota SUVs. I remember being there and we had this discussion. So those two are needed. On the third one, the investment from the public sector. I was reading the IMF benchmarks. So this year they are envisaging that 2.3 percentage of GDP is the public sector investment for Pakistan. Just to give you a figure, go back 10, 15 years, this used to be 4 percentage of the GDP. So our public sector investment has also receded over time as our fiscal has deteriorated and we have not had those kinds of monies. So public sector revamp maybe. I've always said, we have a big throw forward for laymen. That for understanding, that means that we have projects which will not be completed in the next 10, 15 years. So Pakistan must need to think once again what the federal government should do in terms of development, what the provinces should do, and what we can do to finish in the next 2 to 4 years in terms of that infrastructure which is helpful in getting private sector in. The PPP model in Pakistan is talked a lot. It has only succeeded in Sindh to an extent. Otherwise, I think the private sector has not really been able to collaborate, and where we have not succeeded. I am more of a let the private sector do what it wants to do on their own in terms of efficiency. So, now these are difficult, hard working areas. My submission now, after doing the program, is the following. Pakistan has bought very, very important time and very, very critical space to do the structural work in the next 2 years. We don't even have the third year, because when the fund gets into the third year, things may get tricky. And the government would have passed its prime time. We would be thinking of, in a different mode. The next 2 years, the current financial year and the next financial year, are key to move forward on energy sector, on regulatory reforms, on investment reforms, on growth reforms. The time and space is very clear. I wanted the fund program so that the government, the state had the stability to be able to pursue all this. Now the ball is squarely in our court.
Right, Dr. Najeeb. Now, earlier you mentioned there has been a sign of macroeconomic stability with inflation going down, the current account deficit also reduced, forex reserves increased, with investor confidence also increased. Now, during this particular high-level engagement, the Pakistan's delegation meeting the Deputy Managing Director of the IMF talked about expanding the fiscal space by broadening the tax base also, right? Now, when we talk about how do you see the performance in the recent past, we have seen a number of measures brought in by the authorities in order to broaden the tax base. So far, how these measures have worked, how the performance has been, and what could be done more in that particular area.
So, this is probably one of the most crucial areas that we need to think about. And the reason is the following. Pakistan has maintained a 9 to 10% of GDP tax to GDP ratio over the last 10 years. All efforts to improve this have not yielded result. I have this slide that I use when I'm presenting Pakistan, even in Pakistan or abroad. And over the last 10, 12 years, it has just a straight line, 9.5, 8.8, and that's where we are last year also. So now, one are the broadening measures, which are, the difficult ones: real estate, retail, agriculture income tax. This time, what you see, and this is something, the program is different this time. The provinces have been roped in the program, and agriculture income tax starting from January 2025 has to be done at par with Jawad's salary. So what they are asking is, if Jawad's paying, 25% on his salary, then the agriculture income should be yielding the same kind of result. Now, that's a big turn of events when we think about that. So I think that will be crucial. On the traders, on the wholesalers, we have once again not done well. I'm sorry to mention that the Tajir Dost scheme that we came up with, the numbers that I've seen in the paper, and these are, I mean, usually I quote figures that I have clarity from the authorities, but since they have not contested, the figure that has been quoted is a paltry amount. So, yes, the resolve of the government,
But the step is
the
already being taken in the right direction. Am I correct on that? And what else
yes, I
needs to
think
be
that
done in order to improve the efficiency of that scheme which has been introduced that you just mentioned?
yeah, I think they need to sit with all the stakeholders, and I think they need to come with, an approach that the nation really stands behind. I mean, it is not fair that the income tax on the earners should be at an exorbitant 470 billion rupees for the financial year, when we can't even take 50 billion rupees from a sector which contributes 20 to 40% of the economy. So they have to have a stakeholder consultation. They have to then do their own data analysis, rope in Nadra data, rope in bank data, rope in travel data, rope in car buying data, rope in property data, and then send notices of pre-populated returns to these guys. It is just not going to work. I mean, I think that time has really passed. And where I say the
What
authorities
needs to
have
be
to
done
come,
now? What needs to be done
absolutely.
now?
So, I mean, on the other side, I think the trade community themselves have to think through. I mean, the country is just not going to work with this. If Tajir Dost has not succeeded, then they maybe need to redesign this program, and
Right.
they need
Right.
to
Another point.
then
Another
find
point.
a
Your point is
close.
Your point is well taken, Dr. Najeeb. Another very important point that you already briefly touched upon in your earlier take. There's been discussion regarding building climate resilience and sustainability financing. You already alluded to Resilience Sustainability Fund. Now, this particular fund, how is it is going to be operationalized, and what is there for Pakistan in it?
So I think Pakistan is in a 3-year facility. Pakistan has put together a package of a commitment to implementing policy reforms aimed at reducing macro critical risks associated with climate change and pandemic preparedness. I think those are the two things that form the package of high quality reform measures. So if that booklet is acceptable and we can find a framework from there, we are a middle income country, so that's taken care of as well. So what the RSF will do for us? So it aims to improve the balance of payment stability further. So it'll build our reserves. It'll promote sustainability of the external account through financial support that can come through. And those measures that we will take over the next couple of years under the facility will prevent us from a greater damage in terms of the external or the exogenous, whether it's a flood, whether it's climate change, whether it's earthquake, whatever kind of thing. So the climate adaptation strategies align well with the objectives of the RSF, will be what the fund would be seeing, and that's good for Pakistan also. So I think potentially we can access that. In my last conversation abroad, I remember that IMF's perspective was that once we have the longer term facility in place and we see it working, we can have a discussion on this. I think this would be a time when they would be having that discussion. So all in all, the climate related challenges would form a part of the next 2 years through this. Plus, you can have a better balance of payment situation. So I think it's a good story for Pakistan.
Dr. KhaqanNajeeb, former advisor of the Ministry of Finance, thank you very much for taking time out for Views on News tonight. Really appreciate that. Mr. Sultan, I really seek your pardon to keep you all sitting over here. There were a lot of important points to be discussed with Dr. KhaqanNajeeb. He had to leave earlier for an important engagement. So, Mr. Haider, now talking about this high-level engagement between Pakistan's delegation and the Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, expanding the fiscal space by broadening the tax base. A number of important points have been mentioned by Dr. Najeeb also. How do you look at that? So far the performance, in order to broaden it, what else needs to be done on that account?
You see, it's not more about what else needs to be done. On each of these streams that have been identified with the IMF and the IMF program, we need to do a lot of different steps to implement these. For example, broadening the tax base, right? That in itself, just like it has been mentioned, so agriculture is a big domain, traders is a big domain, and series of things. So implementing these. So I think just to zoom out and see, the IMF program has to be implemented. It's a very good thing, the space that we are in at the moment, because you see the problem that IMF has been having with Pakistan. I think people of Pakistan should have been having the same problem with Pakistan, because structural reforms were needed, yes. Everybody understood that, yes. Everybody understood that for the last 20 years, yes. But they were not happening. And it was very sporadic, right? We would take some action, then we would not take a series of actions. Now what is happening is that IMF has asked us that the reforms that we have agreed to undertake, we should see them through. Now, over the last, this program has just gotten started. We had this temporary program for 1 year. So what has been happening, and the previous program had to be implemented to a certain degree in terms of completion. So now seeing this through over the next 3 years, if this happens, we will see a lot of structural changes in the Pakistan economy that will bring it towards further stability. And the meeting which is happening in Washington right now, where it is, I would say it's a very, very good sign that now we are in an working relationship, active working relationship in terms of seeing the program through. So I feel purely from not just investor confidence, but also confidence in terms of people of Pakistan, that yes, we have started to move in the right direction, and irrespective of whatever is happening overall in terms of the political space, all parties, all government stakeholders, everyone has agreed that this plan is something that we would be continuing to follow.
Right. Talha, let's talk about the RSF. What is this Resilience Sustainability Fund?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And this fund is actually very innovative in regards to its facility, because it's a long-term plan. It's 20 years facility that once you get a loan, it's 20 years you need to pay back. First 10 years are the grace period, and afterwards you pay it back by slowly and forward you to the IMF. But again, the point which is important to understand into this facility is that once you get the fund, you have certain obligations regarding to the program. As we talk about climate change in Pakistan, we are one of the most 8th most vulnerable country in the world, and constantly we have our crop failure. Every year we have floods, and because of that, the economy is actually getting hurt very badly. World Bank has actually published a report on Pakistan profiling. They did a climate profiling on Pakistan, and they mentioned it that we can face by 2050 15 to 20% GDP loss per annum. So it's a humongous loss for the economies like ours, and because of that, we need much more facilities like this. If we look at the IMF and World Bank, they're continuously talking about how we can make sure that small developing countries or the developing nations or the underdeveloping, least developing countries can maintain their economic feasibility in the longer run. And that is why this RSF is the one who actually places the resilience into the economy. because once we have the floods of 2022, it's one of the biblical disasters, and we have 30 billion losses within 1 month. That is humongous. That none of the economy is actually, if we talk about currently in the US, we are they actually faced 2 back-on-back hurricanes, which actually put the pressure on the economy near to $50 billion. So when we are talking about in billions, and we are talking about
Okay, indeed, of course, everybody knows that the kind of humongous losses we had to face after the 2022 floods. Now, specifically talking about this RSF, it's a 20-year
it's a 20-year plan.
What are the core objectives of it? Once a country qualifies to get that particular funding, what are going to be the objectives? For example, in instance of Pakistan, there has been vulnerable to climate disasters over the last many years now, and we have seen that manifested in the forms of 2022 floods. Once Pakistan is qualified for this, a country like Pakistan, how do you think it's going to navigate through keeping in the objectives of that particular fund? Is the onus going to be only on the shoulders of the authorities within that particular country, or is something going to be happening from external help also?
Well, again, as you can see, the RSF is basically the sustainability fund. Once we have the disaster impacted on the economy like ours, these funds are there to liquidate those pockets of financial losses which the locals have bearded. Why I am telling about these constant repetitive order of disasters which we face, because of the small farmers or the small income holders are actually impacted the most, and these facilities help them.
How is it going to translate?
More like
as a practical help towards the small farmers.
Like if we talk about farmers, the small single unit farmers, we can get insured. The crop can get insured. Like if there is a heat wave, and then in the coming year, the crop can be insured that if the crop failed, we can give back money to the farmer. So they can have
so what
that
about the
confidence
loss? What about the loss?
The loss is actually
the material loss.
The material
you can ensure the security of the farmer if there happens to be a crop loss. What about the material loss?
You cannot do anything.
Okay, so what about the resilience? I mean, how resilience is going to be built? How this funding is going to be channeled into making a material resilience on the ground, so that we can actually preempt and deal and address with all those effects of climate change?
Well, that's what I'm telling you, that we cannot recover the material loss. What we can do is to retain the confidence of the farmer. To
okay,
reinvest
but
into
we
the
can
farm.
preempt and we can prepare ourselves in order to address the future catastrophes if and when they happen.
Yeah.
How this particular fund is going to add to that?
Well, it can improve the technological tools to the farmers, that how they can engage with the meteorological differentiations, like what are the current climatic, microclimatic conditions over there, and how they can move into certain direction, like how they can harness the hybrid genes or hybrid seeds that can provide more resilient crops to the coming time. And through this finance, through this facility, we can provide those critical financial pockets to the owners of those agricultural lands to maintain those resources in time. And because of that, I think that these constant variation of the pattern of the climate conditions, we need constant monitoring of the sites. And because of that, once we have those monitoring units onto district level, and there are actually DDMAs, our district disaster management units are present, and through those units we can harness those information, and from that these facilities can provide better financial stability to the local investors.
So has it, this particular fund, has it to do only with the crops, or when we talk about the other infrastructure, which also get damaged or destroyed because of the climate catastrophes?
Yeah,
does this particular fund deal with that in order to build the resilience as far as the infrastructure is concerned?
It is actually deal with all of those climate conditions which we can see in our countries, because not only the agriculture side, but also the investments in the renewable energy sector. Also into the infrastructure side, we can improve our building codes, and we can build the capacity of the local persons in that regard. So it actually deals with all of it. It depends upon our planning and development, how we can use these facilities for the problems we have, because climate change is a global phenomena but have the local solution. So you cannot say that this particular fund only answer to those particular areas. It's more like a generic thing, but you can channelize it into your own capacity.
So, Talha, why this particular fund? Of course, it has to be returned. Am I correct on
Yes,
that? What,
it
okay,
has to
so with a relatively longer span of time, right? 20 years that you already mentioned, 10 years, the grace period. What about climate justice? As you have just mentioned, that Pakistan has been vulnerable to the wrongdoings of the industrialized nations. Also, that was also mentioned by the UN Secretary General when he witnessed those biblical floods over here back in 2022 firsthand. He also talked about climate justice. So, what about climate justice? Why to qualify for such a fund, which has to be returned at the end of the day? Why not climate justice and that funding, which doesn't require any return?
Well, honestly, I feel like it's been the 80 years of Bretton Woods agreement which we have, and because of that, we have those financial system around us. And I feel like it's a vicious cycle which we have around us, that the climate debt is actually increasing onto multiple nations. It's not only us, it's 46 countries which are actually into this debt cycle. And there is a clause of differentiate but common responsibilities into the Paris Agreement, and this COP is actually on the center point for this. Because on COP29 we are going to talk about the new financial goals that minimum we every year expect from, apart from China, we need around $1 trillion per annum to facilitate those adaptation needs which every country need. So once we talk about such kind of loans which are longer in period, but the money we are talking about is around 1.5 billion, 1 to 1.5 billion, but the annual investment we need for the climate adaptation and mitigation only is 7 to 14 billion dollars. So it's far more than what we can.
Which head requires more of funding, more of support towards these developing countries, adaptation or mitigation? I'll come back to you. Let me bring in Mr. Haider into the discussion also. Mr. Haider, a number of other areas have been discussed in this particular meeting. We've already talked about expanding the fiscal space by broadening the tax base. We've seen the kind of measures which have been put in by the authorities recently. They've actually started yielding the results, the fruits also. So, of course, a lot needs to be done on that particular front. When we talk about the private sector growth, earlier, Dr. Najeeb talked about 3 different heads of investment. So, how do you relate those heads of investment with the private sector growth in particular? And the second head Dr. Najeeb talked about was the private investment. How crucial that one is when we talk about the domestic private investment?
You see, okay, so first of all, I agree on all of the accounts. I think it was very nicely put by Dr. Najeeb. In terms of investment, first of all, he mentioned private sector growth and investment and the government sector investment. Since we are already in the tight fiscal space, so to expect the government to do a lot of investment, I think that is not very prudent. That is where private sector has to step in, right? So I think in terms of economy, our focus and reliance is more on the private sector investment. Private sector investment, again, we can differentiate between FDI and the local private sector investing in. Now, I think as a country, we have always been focused a lot on FDI, right? And chasing FDI, and it's coming in and doing the magic, right? But FDI has a lot of variables, right? And in case there's some change, these transactions usually take longer time to gestate, right? It doesn't happen in a month or 2 time, because we're talking about large transactions. Private sector is something the outside investor will look at, what is the country risk, what is the political risk, what is this risk, what is that risk. Local private sector, they live in this economy, they know that this economy works really well, right? And if we go back to very basic economics principle, right? So whenever there are barriers to entry, the margins are really high in that industry. So if we look at Pakistan, the perceived barriers to entry are high, right? Simultaneously, the margins in Pakistan, so people who are doing business in Pakistan successfully, we know that they make a lot of money and the margins are really high. So it's just about giving confidence to the private sector, and then it is also to channelize the private sector in the right direction. For example, diverting their focus from investing in real estate to industry. So now if we can make that transition, for example, getting them to invest more on export related industry, getting them to invest more on, for example, IT sector. And so we have growing population, young population in terms of IT skills.
What's required in order to get that diversion from real estate to IT in particular, and also what are those basic steps in order to boost their confidence?
Okay, a couple of points that come to my mind. One is, again, in terms of taxation, we see that industry is very heavily regulated and taxed, right? Simultaneously, real estate is not taxed, right? So, in somebody is into real estate, then they feel like they can make tax-free profits, so to say, right? So, capital gains are.
But this time, a couple of measures have been brought in order
yes,
to
exactly.
address that issue also, as far as the real estate sector is concerned.
They have been brought in terms of the focus of the finance minister when he was taking over, even before taking over and after taking over. His focus was exactly this: how do we do that? And a lot of steps have been taken, and a lot of steps will be taken in that regard. So directionally, that is the right thing. Secondly, in terms of capital formation, right? So it is easy to invest in real estate, right? Because we have 50% odd of our economy is cash-based economy. 50%, broadly it's 49, 51%, right? Broadly, half of the economy is money is in banking, right? Half of the money is outside. Now, to encourage that money to come in and do the investments into industry, export-related industry, IT, all of these things, I believe the barriers are higher because in terms of, again, documentation and taxation and all of that. Now, it's a very difficult space to go through, right? Because recently we have also come out of FATF grey list. So we have gone into that space that once the documentation starts, then a lot of details come in. What's the source of cash, where that money is coming in, where that money is going, right? Then secondly, in terms of taxation, right? One, there's a lot of focus on that we need to increase tax. So people are also scared. Once you get into tax net, then you're really caught, right? So it's sort of a vicious cycle. Now, if we go back into the history during Musharraf era, right? It was the flip side. The whole concept was that we have to increase documentation, we have to enhance the tax base. So taxes were rather lowered. Taxes were lowered, it was made easy. So a lot of people were like, okay, so we come in, get registered, things are easy, tax base is low. Now we are doing it in a different way. For example, again, there was this recent news item by the finance minister also, right? So people, the category of non-filer will get eliminated, right? After 14th of October. Now, how it's going to be implemented is a question mark. So, for example, if somebody is non-filer, will they not be able to do any real estate transaction or any, for example, vehicle transaction, right? So they'll be forced to quickly do that. So those are kind of things. So now I think it's a difficult thing, and that not only the government, also the population is going through. So these are going to be a relatively tough couple of years where we transition into the space where tax base is also broadened, more taxes also started coming in. But going back to the capital formation thing, I think one thing that government should keep in mind is that it should make it easy, and people should not be scared in bringing their cash and investing it into the industry. Right now, the easiest space for people sitting on cash is to put it into real estate.
Okay, Talha, now adaptation and mitigation, which requires more of deliberation, and which one could be addressed with less opening as compared to the other?
Well, in the Pakistan scenario, we need more adaptation rather than mitigation, because we are mitigation is for the high emitting countries, for the G7, and for us, it's more adaptation.
Why is that so?
Because of our conditions, because of the infrastructure. IMF actually did, last 2 years actually did a study on Pakistan, and they concluded this, that the highest fatalities we have is due to earthquake because of the lack of the building code. So those are the conditions which we have right now. So adaptation is one of the major need because most of the population is vulnerable and living below to the poverty line. So they cannot go for the climate buyouts, as I can mention you in the regards for the solar energy capacity. If you can see the Pakistan scenario, we have larger and larger number of the solar installation into the households, which are getting de-linked from the main energy grid, national energy grid, and because of that there is a certain barrier into the market. And these things actually generate a problem when you don't implement the policies according to your own needs, rather than you implement it onto the Western psychology. So we need to change that, and these funds, SRF, we can change that in a manner like increase the confidence of the local person to make sure they reinvest into their own domains, and from that you can improve the quality of the vulnerability of the people actually. And that is why I say that adaptation is one of the most critical areas where we need to. And if we look at the budget of 2024 to 2025, we still have a lot more money is actually put into mitigation rather than in adaptation.
So in that particular head, adaptation, as per your understanding, is more important for countries like Pakistan. Where to start from?
Well, first of all, you need to, as I mentioned, you will need to look into your building codes. What kind of buildings you have? Mostly, what we have, as if you remember that. And when we talk about couple of times, I mentioned you about the heat wave, and the heat wave, the temperature is above 30 degrees centigrade in the night too, and because of that those buildings are get very hot, and people are actually getting
they absorb the
it.
So what's the alternative?
We need to build environmental friendly buildings or green buildings through which we can actually lower the temperature of the community in a manner where we can add green spaces into this. Urban forestry can be added into that. Banigala have urban forest, but unfortunately due to construction of those Barako bypass, that half of that forest is actually cut down for the development side. So we need to look into our priority areas. What are our priorities? In my point of view, I think adaptation and securing the local personalities or the local investors are very important.
TalhaTufail Bhatti, heading a Strengthening Regional Climate Resilience Program at the Institute of Regional Studies in Islamabad. Thank you very much for being with us on the show tonight. Really appreciate that. Mr. Sultan Ali Haider, expert political economy. Thank you very much for your time also for being with us on the show tonight. Really appreciate that. With that, we come to the end of today's episode. Till the next one, take good care of yourselves.